Hey guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this YouTube video, I want to give you some insights on how do we get stronger and how does that affect our program. And why are we taking a look at this? Because you need to understand those basic principles behind getting stronger to then understand the programming takeaways that directly come from these principles, because that is really the basic knowledge behind how strength training and also strength training programming works. So let's not waste our time and dive directly into it, and let's answer the question, how do we actually get stronger? To just make that a bit more visible and not only put that in words so you can imagine how that process in the body works, I created a graphic for you. Sure, that is not 100% precisely, but in my opinion, it just helps to really understand those mechanisms better. So what do we have here? We have one muscle. That circle here is one muscle, and those little circles here are the muscle fibers that are building up that bigger muscle. We have the y-axis here, which is the strength potential. So the bigger that circle here is, the bigger the strength potential of that muscle is. And on the x-axis, we have the strength output. And the strength output tells you how much weight basically that muscle can move. Then we have those red dots and those empty dots here, and the red dot is a recruited muscle fiber. So imagine we're doing a biceps curl, and then those red fibers would be those fibers that actually actively contract and lift up the weight, and the empty ones are inactive muscle fibers. They don't pull on the weight, so they don't help with that movement. So, and here we have those different mechanisms that bring us closer to our maximum strength output. And now let's just start with the first one, which is the so-called intermuscular coordination, which tells us how muscles optimally cooperate with each other during a movement. This basically means to really, let's consider a biceps curl, that we can curl that weight up. We need to have one muscle active, and the muscle on the other side, the antagonist, needs to be inactive. Because if the triceps pulls here, my biceps can't create the maximum force output. And next thing is technique, timing. So there are different aspects of the intermuscular coordination that can bring us more strength output or harm the strength output. So that is basically the more technical or learning aspect of a movement. So the better your technique is and the better you are at doing this movement, the more strength output you actually have. Then the second mechanism we want to take a look at is the so-called neuromuscular coordination, which tells us the number of motor units or muscle fibers that are recruited at the same time. If we're now taking a look at the graph here, where are the red dots are active muscle fibers or recruited muscle fibers. The more muscle fibers are recruited, so are actively putting in work for a certain movement, the more strength output we have with that movement. So if we're taking the biceps curl again, the more fibers of my biceps are active at the same time, the more weight I can move here. So neuromuscular coordination tells us how much fibers of that we actually have are really active at the same time during a movement. And to have that correct, since our nervous system is not recruiting every muscle fiber itself, it's recruiting motor units, and the motor unit connects basically several muscle fibers together, so that it's just bundles of muscle fibers and not every single muscle fiber is activated by the nervous system. But that actually doesn't matter for that understanding here, so let's just keep it with the muscle fibers. And so we have intermuscular coordination, so the technical part, how the muscles cooperate with each other. we have neuromuscular coordination, so how many muscle fibers are actually activated or recruited at the same time for a movement. And the last part is the cross-sectional area here of the muscle, or the so-called hypertrophy. So an increase, as I said, of the cross-sectional area of a muscle means a bigger muscle is always a stronger muscle because it has a bigger strength potential. As you can see here in that graph, the strength potential is higher. Meaning that once we've reached with a certain muscle size, our maximum strength potential, or we are getting pretty close to that strength potential, what we need to do is to implement hypertrophy work, because we need a bigger cross-sectional area to just create more strength potential. And yeah, how do we train for these different mechanisms? For that, we have a table here which just shows the repetition maximum continuum, so basically rep ranges. So 1 rep max would be the maximum weight I can use for 1 repetition. 3 RM is the maximum weight I can use for 3 repetitions, and so on and so on. And this table shows which training goal is trained best at which rep range, basically. So as you can see, it's always fluid borders, it's nothing fixed, but you can see which rep range is dominant for which training goals, highlighted with bigger letters and in yellow here. But let's start with the intermuscular coordination. How do we get better in that? Training that movement, that exercise more often. So repetition. The more often you do it, the better your body will get in that movement, obviously. And for more complex movements, you can then also implement technique training to really get also the last percentages, and to always make sure that your training technique is on point to have the optimal intermuscular coordination. Second thing, or second mechanism, is the neuromuscular coordination. And we can improve the neuromuscular coordination with strength training. And as you know, strength training is best done or dominantly done in the 1 to 5 rep range. So highlighted here again. And how do we, or which intensity should we use to really trigger that neuromuscular coordination? And that is done at intensity 80% plus 1 RM of a certain movement. It's always important to divide that in movements, because you don't have just 1 repetition max. You have an individual one for every exercise. Obviously, your biceps curl 1 RM is a different one than from your pull-up or from your dip one. So when we're talking about the 1 RMs, it's always individual for a certain exercise, and that should be also treated like this. So neuromuscular coordination is trained with strength training, 1 to 5 rep range dominantly, and intensities of 80% plus. And what else do we have? The last mechanism was hypertrophy, and hypertrophy is stimulated with hypertrophy training or volume training, and that is dominantly done in the 6 to 12 rep range, and the intensity should be around about 60 to 80% of the run rep max in that movement. So again, I want to really point out that these are no fixed borders. Just because you're doing 6 to 8 reps in a set doesn't mean that it's not stimulating neuromuscular coordination and you're not getting stronger. And if you're training in a 3 repetition max rep range, that it's not providing you a hypertrophy stimulus. It's just dominantly for one mechanism more than another one. And so there's no black and white thinking here, and this is really super important to understand, and that's why I can't point that out often enough. Good. We now learned how to really stimulate those different mechanisms, but how do we implement this in the program? how do we actually program this. And here you might now have like that slight click and say, okay, that's where those terms actually come from, and that's why I need a strength phase, and that's why I need a hypertrophy phase, because we just want to put emphasis on different mechanisms of getting stronger. In the hypertrophy phase, we want to focus on increasing the cross-sectional area, so we actually want to increase the strength potential that we can then maximize in a strength phase, or the other way around. So those are actually just two different phases of the bigger picture, and nothing that has nothing to do with each other. And with that video, I just want to make clear that these two things are really connected to each other, and you can't separate strength and hypertrophy from each other. And that hopefully now is getting more clear what is actually the idea behind the strength phase and what is actually the idea behind the hypertrophy phase. And yeah, let's now take a look at how we set those up. Short summary here: a strength phase, as we learned, or strength training as we learned, is to be done dominantly in the 1 to 5 rep range with high intensities of 80+% 1RM. Whereas hypertrophy work should be, or in a hypertrophy phase, you should dominantly train in the 6 to 12 rep range with those intensities. But as you can see, hypertrophy is nothing exclusive in this rep range, and strength is nothing exclusive in that rep range. So what do we do here? Short disclaimer here. If you take a look at your training, and you have strength phases, you have hypertrophy phases, you don't want to have them exclusive. So in a hypertrophy phase, you don't want to have only 6 to 12 rep range, and in a strength phase, you don't only want to have 1 to 5 rep ranges. Why is that the case? So imagine you've worked in a strength phase to a certain working weight, and you've done everything to really make your nervous system, your neuromuscular coordination, stimulate that to really be able to work with those high additional weights. And then you're entering a hypertrophy phase and you skip all the strength work, and you lose the neuromuscular coordination. That's something you don't want to do. Same other way around. If you're entering a strength phase, you don't want to skip all the hypertrophy work and focus only on neuromuscular coordination, because that could lead to too less volume, and you actually will lose muscle in a long strength period. So takeaway here, and very, very important for you to understand, is that a hypertrophy phase should also include strength elements, and a strength phase should also include hypertrophy elements. And how can that look like in your program is something I designed for you here. We assume a volume recommendation, which is a good start value. It's always individual, but if you have no clue where to start, that is a good start value of 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group as a volume recommendation. And this you can then split up. If you're entering a hypertrophy phase, you want to have like 12 to 17% in that rep range to really still stimulate your neuromuscular coordination, to keep your nervous system adapted to higher loads, and to make sure that all those muscle fibers are recruited at the same time, as we learned. Your dominant work part should be here though, between 6 and 12 reps with this percentages, and you also can include, for several reasons we don't want to discuss now, also 15 plus reps here. And then actually exactly the opposite for strength. You want to focus on the 1 to 5 rep range. You want to still keep hypertrophy elements here to not lose any muscle mass. And in the strength phase, this rep range obviously is not too important, so you can skip that or slightly include that. Good. Then there are directly coming a lot of questions if we're thinking about this. So how does the intensity and the volume actually interact with each other? So if I increase intensity, do I keep the volume the same? Do I increase the volume? Do I lower the volume? And in which phase I do what? How do I adjust that over time? Like, do I always go from hypertrophy strength? How does that work? And in those cycles, how do I scale my numbers? How do I consider overlaps? So if I program certain exercises with a certain volume, how do I count that volume? Which exercise affects each other? Does the strength work affect the hypertrophy work, and so on? And how do I combine different goals? Maybe I want to have a super strong back squat, but I want to have a good M-rep pull-up. Like, how do I combine this? What exercises do I need in those, certain phases for certain goals? So there are a lot of questions coming up, and those are actually answered best in my online coaching. So some advertisement here. I will definitely also produce some other YouTube videos on those topics, but in my online coaching, what I do is I give you an individual programming to really tackle those issues here, and I discuss that with you. So you don't only get a program, we will go through the exercises. Why are we including this exercise? Why this rep range? Why in that phase? So actually the individual programming is explained, which is super important. So you as my client understand why are we actually doing what we're doing. Second part, technique feedback. So to make sure you're not getting injured, to make sure you are working with the best muscular coordination, there is a technique feedback weekly on your training. So you learn how movement should look like, and you learn how that should look like on your own body. And that is the big difference to a tutorial video, because in a tutorial I can show you how it looks on my body, but your body is different, and that movement might look totally different on your body. Different technique, different style, and so on. So technique feedback on your training. And the third big part, which is pretty unique in the online coaching world, is that I provide monthly educational seminars like this one here, but way bigger. 2 of them every month, where we exactly talking about those topics that we talked about today. To just, coaching is not forever, and I want you to be better afterwards than before. And for that, I try to give out as much value as possible to you, to make sure you understand all the concepts behind resistance training, behind exercise science, calisthenics, so you can, after you drop out of the coaching, continue, to perform on a high level for you or even your clients if you're also into coaching. And how do you enter the online coaching? Just make sure to visit kingofweighted.com and then click on the online coaching tab, and there you can just book your free consulting call. And then that is 15 minutes of just, talking about the online coaching service. Is that something for you? Do that works? Is that something you're looking for? And I will then give you some more insights on how I work, how you can enter. So if you're interested in the online coaching, just book your free consulting call, and then see you in that call.